In the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was no longer a question of who would win. The only question left was how long the fighting would continue before the inevitable collapse of Nazi Germany. Across the Western Front, Allied armies were advancing at a speed that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. Entire German units were surrendering by the thousands. Cities were falling one after another, and the once powerful German war machine was breaking apart under the relentless pressure from every direction. For years, Germany had appeared unstoppable. When the war began in 1939, the German military launched a series of lightning-fast campaigns that shocked the world. Poland collapsed in weeks. France, one of Europe's strongest powers, fell in just over a month. German armies pushed deep into the Soviet Union, while their submarines hunted Allied ships across the Atlantic. At the center of this military system stood an officer corps that believed deeply in discipline, hierarchy, and the power of rank. In the German military tradition, an officer was expected to command respect under any circumstance. But by early 1945, that entire world was collapsing. The Western Allies had crossed the Rhine River, the last major natural barrier protecting the German heartland. In March of that year, American forces captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen in a dramatic and unexpected victory. Within days, thousands of Allied troops poured across the river and began spreading rapidly across western Germany. The defenses that were supposed to stop them simply did not exist anymore. German soldiers on the ground could see the truth clearly. Their supply lines were shattered. Fuel was scarce, ammunition was limited. Entire divisions existed only on paper. Some units were commanded by young officers barely out of training, while older veterans tried to hold together formations that had been reduced to fragments after years of brutal fighting. At the same time, the Red Army was advancing from the east with overwhelming force. Soviet troops had already pushed through Poland and were now driving toward Berlin itself. For German soldiers, the situation was terrifying. They were trapped between two enormous Allied armies that were closing in from opposite directions. As Allied forces moved deeper into Germany, the number of prisoners captured each day grew larger and larger. American divisions often found themselves responsible for thousands of captured German soldiers at a time. Temporary prisoner of war camps had to be established quickly, sometimes in open fields surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by exhausted troops who had been fighting only days earlier. Many of the captured soldiers were young conscripts or older men who had been pulled into the army during the final desperate months of the war. They were tired, hungry, and relieved that the fighting was finally over for them. Some surrendered the moment they saw Allied tanks appear on the horizon. But not everyone accepted defeat so easily. Among the prisoners were experienced officers who had spent their entire careers inside the rigid traditions of the German military system. These men had been trained to believe that rank defined everything. Authority, respect, obedience, all of it flowed from the position an officer held within the chain of command. Even as the war was collapsing around them, many of these officers still clung tightly to those beliefs. In their minds, capture did not erase rank. A German colonel was still a colonel, a German major was still a major, and they expected to be treated accordingly. This belief would soon collide with the reality of defeat. Across Germany, Allied troops were encountering strange and sometimes tense situations inside the growing prisoner camps. In some places, German officers attempted to organize their captured soldiers according to the same strict military hierarchy that had existed before their surrender. They issued orders, maintained discipline among their men, and demanded recognition of their authority. To many Allied soldiers, this behavior seemed almost absurd. The men guarding these camps had fought their way across France, Belgium, and Germany itself. They had seen the destruction left behind by years of war. Some had lost close friends in battles against the very soldiers now standing quietly behind barbed wire. For them, the war was not about rank anymore. It was about survival, victory, and ending the conflict as quickly as possible. Still, the traditions of military conduct were complicated. According to international conventions governing prisoners of war, officers were often treated differently from enlisted men. They were not always required to perform labor, and in some cases they were allowed to maintain limited authority over their own soldiers. But these rules were never designed for the massive scale of surrender that was happening in 1945. By April, entire German formations were laying down their weapons at once. Tens of thousands of prisoners had to be processed, searched, documented, and guarded. The Allied soldiers responsible for handling this enormous task had little patience for captured officers demanding special treatment. In many camps, tension quietly simmered beneath the surface. Some German officers refused to accept simple instructions from guards who were technically lower in rank than they were. Others insisted on formal recognition of their titles and authority. A few still carried themselves with the same rigid confidence they had displayed when Germany believed victory was certain. But the reality outside the barbed wire was undeniable. German cities were burning, Allied aircraft dominated the skies, supply trains no longer arrived, communications were breaking down everywhere. Even the German high command was struggling to maintain control as the front lines collapsed. And yet, inside the prisoner camps, fragments of the old orders still remained. In muddy fields across western Germany, groups of captured officers stood together, their uniforms still bearing the insignia of rank. Some tried to maintain the dignity they believed their positions required. Others simply waited, silent and uncertain about what the future would bring. For many of them, the war had defined their entire lives. They had grown up during a time when German military traditions were considered sacred. Discipline, loyalty, and honor were drilled into them from the moment they first entered training. Their careers had been built on the belief that the German army represented strength, order, and national pride. Now that world was gone. The Allied advance continued day after day, pushing deeper into what remained of Nazi Germany. Tanks rolled through shattered towns. Long columns of prisoners marched toward improvised camps. Overhead, Allied aircraft roared across the sky almost without opposition. The end of the war in Europe was only weeks away. But in one muddy prisoner of war camp during those final days, a small confrontation was about to unfold, a confrontation that would perfectly capture the clash between the pride of a defeated officer and the harsh reality of total defeat. And standing at the center of that moment would be one of the most feared commanders of the Allied armies, a man known for his aggressive leadership, blunt words, and absolute refusal to tolerate arrogance from an enemy who had already lost the war. General George C. Patton.
By April 1945, the Western Front had turned into a massive tide of surrender. Every day, thousands of German soldiers were laying down their weapons as Allied forces pushed deeper into what remained of Nazi Germany. Roads that had once carried tanks and supply convoys now filled with long columns of exhausted prisoners marching under guard. For the Allied armies, victory was clearly within reach, but victory also brought an enormous logistical problem that few had fully anticipated. What do you do when entire enemy armies surrender all at once? American units that had been designed to handle hundreds of prisoners suddenly found themselves responsible for thousands. Temporary prisoner of war camps had to be created almost overnight. Open farmland, abandoned airfields, and empty pastures were quickly surrounded with barbed wire. Guard towers were sometimes nothing more than wooden platforms hastily built by engineers who were already overwhelmed with other tasks. One of the most famous examples was the series of massive enclosures along the Rhine River that Allied troops would later call the Rhine Meadow camps. These areas held tens of thousands of German prisoners at a time. In some locations, the number of prisoners far exceeded the number of guards assigned to watch them. Conditions inside these camps were rough and often chaotic. The ground was muddy from spring rains and shelter was limited. Many prisoners had nothing but the uniforms they were captured in. Tents were scarce, and some soldiers slept in shallow holes dug into the ground for protection against wind and rain. Food was distributed carefully but in limited quantities. The Allied supply system was stretched thin by the rapid advance across Germany. Feeding both advancing armies and massive numbers of prisoners created constant logistical pressure. Yet despite the difficult conditions, something unusual could be seen inside many of these camps. Even after surrendering, many German soldiers continued to behave as if their military structure still existed. Groups naturally formed according to the units they had belonged to before capture. Former company commanders gathered their men together. Non-commissioned officers still gave quiet instructions. Some prisoners even tried to maintain regular routines, organizing lines, cleaning areas of the camp, and keeping order among themselves. But the most striking behavior often came from the officers. In the German military tradition, the officer corps had always held a special status. Officers were expected to lead not only with authority, but with a certain sense of dignity and distance from the enlisted ranks. Many had been trained for years in strict academies where discipline and hierarchy were treated almost like sacred principles. Capture did not immediately erase those habits. Inside the camps, German officers frequently gathered together, standing apart from the rest of the prisoners. Their uniforms still displayed the insignia of rank: silver bars, oak leaves, and shoulder boards that had once commanded unquestioned authority on battlefields across Europe. To them, those symbols still mattered. Some officers insisted that their men continue to show them the same respect they had before surrender. In several camps, prisoners were seen saluting their former commanders, even though the war was effectively over for them. To Allied soldiers watching from the guard towers, the scene could feel strange and almost surreal. These men were prisoners now. Their country was collapsing. Their army was defeated. Yet parts of the old system seemed to survive inside the barbed wire. Not all of the guards reacted the same way. Some American soldiers found the behavior amusing. Others found it irritating. Many of them had fought hard battles against the very army these officers once commanded. They had seen towns destroyed, friends killed, and entire units wiped out during the long years of war. Watching defeated officers still act as though they deserved special treatment could feel deeply frustrating. Still, the situation was complicated by international rules governing prisoners of war. According to the Geneva Convention, captured officers were supposed to receive certain privileges compared to enlisted prisoners. They were not normally required to perform physical labor, and they were often allowed to organize their own internal discipline among fellow prisoners. But the conventions had been written long before anyone imagined the scale of surrender happening in 1945. Entire German divisions were disappearing almost overnight. Some Allied units were processing more prisoners in a single day than the conventions had ever realistically planned for. The result was confusion. Some camps attempted to follow traditional rules as closely as possible. Others simply focused on maintaining basic security and order. Guards had little time to debate fine points of military etiquette when thousands of prisoners had to be fed, counted, and controlled. This difference in expectations created quiet tension inside many camps. German officers who believed strongly in the old military traditions sometimes clashed with the Allied guards guarding them. They demanded to be addressed by their rank. They insisted that guards treat them according to the customs of officer conduct. But to the young American guards standing watch, many of these demands sounded absurd. Some of those guards were barely 20 years old. They had grown up during the Great Depression, been drafted into the army, and sent across the ocean to fight in a war that had already lasted years. Many had fought through the brutal battles in France after the Normandy invasion, through the forests of Belgium during the Battle of the Bulge, and into the final push across Germany. For them, the enemy standing behind the wire was not a respected military colleague. He was a defeated opponent. And the difference between those two viewpoints would soon create moments of sharp confrontation. One of the most common sources of friction involved simple forms of respect. German officers often expected formal recognition of their status. They were used to salutes, formal greetings, and strict adherence to military protocol. But inside the camps, those expectations rarely matched reality.
Allied guards were under no obligation to salute captured enemy officers. In fact, many refused to acknowledge their rank at all. To them, the men behind the wire were prisoners, regardless of what insignia remained on their uniforms. Most of the time, these disagreements ended quietly. Officers might complain, guards might ignore them. Eventually, the daily routine of camp life moved on. But occasionally, the tension became more visible. A proud officer might argue with a guard over proper treatment. A prisoner might refuse a simple instruction because he believed it violated the traditions of military hierarchy. In a few cases, officers openly demanded the respect they believed their rank deserved. Those moments could quickly draw attention from both prisoners and guards. Word would spread through the camp. Small groups would gather nearby, curious to see how the confrontation would end. Most of the time, the situation would be settled by a senior Allied officer stepping in and reminding everyone of the basic reality. The war was over for the prisoners. The authority they once held on the battlefield no longer existed. But pride can be a powerful thing. For officers who had spent their entire lives inside a rigid system of rank and honor, accepting that reality was not always easy. And in one particular camp during the final weeks of the war, that pride would lead to a confrontation that no one present would forget. Because the officer demanding respect that day was about to come face to face with a man who had built his entire reputation on crushing the enemy without hesitation. A commander who had no patience for arrogance from defeated opponents. General George S. Patton was known throughout both Allied and German armies as a leader who believed in one simple truth about war: victory decided everything. And very soon, one captured German officer would learn exactly what that meant.
Among the thousands of German prisoners gathered inside the growing camps of Western Germany in the spring of 1945, most soldiers had already accepted the reality of defeat. They were tired, hungry, and often relieved that their part in the war was finally over. Many had been fighting almost constantly for years, moving from one collapsing front to another as the German military situation grew more desperate. But not every prisoner adjusted to this new reality so easily. For some officers, surrender was more than just the loss of a battle. It was the collapse of an entire worldview they had spent their lives believing in. The German officer corps had long considered itself one of the most disciplined and professional military institutions in the world. From the earliest days of their training, officers were taught that honor, authority, and rank defined their place in society. These ideas had deep historical roots that stretched back to the traditions of the Prussian army in the 19th century. Officers were expected to lead with absolute confidence and to command obedience without hesitation. Their uniforms, insignia, and titles were not just symbols. They represented a system that valued hierarchy and discipline above everything else. Even in defeat, many officers believed those traditions should still apply. Inside one crowded prisoner of war camp in April 1945, a particular German officer stood out from the others. He was not especially old, but he carried himself with the rigid posture of a career soldier who had spent decades inside the military system. His uniform was worn and dusty from the retreat across Germany, yet the insignia on his shoulders still clearly displayed his rank. To him, those symbols still meant something. While many prisoners quietly waited for food or stood in long lines for water, this officer spent much of his time speaking with other captured soldiers, especially the men who had once served under him. Even though they were now prisoners, he expected them to maintain the same discipline they had shown before surrender. Several witnesses later remembered that the officer still gave instructions as if he were commanding a unit rather than standing inside a barbed wire enclosure. He corrected soldiers who stood improperly. He reminded them to maintain order in their section of the camp.
At times, a few men even seemed to respond to him automatically, as if the habits of military obedience were too deeply ingrained to simply disappear overnight. To some of the American guards watching from nearby positions, the scene felt strange. They had seen countless prisoners during the advance into Germany. Most simply followed instructions and tried to stay out of trouble. But this officer behaved differently. He carried himself with a visible sense of pride, almost as if he believed his authority had somehow survived capture. At first, the guards mostly ignored him. The camp was busy, overcrowded, and filled with thousands of prisoners who needed to be processed and monitored. One proud officer trying to maintain discipline among a few soldiers was hardly the most urgent problem the guards faced. But over the next few days, the officer's attitude began attracting more attention. Several times he approached guards with complaints about how prisoners were being treated. According to accounts from Allied personnel, he spoke with a formal tone, as though addressing fellow officers rather than soldiers responsible for guarding him. He insisted that German officers were entitled to certain courtesies under international military customs. In particular, he believed they should be recognized and addressed according to their rank. To the guards, the demand sounded completely out of place. The men standing watch over the camp had spent months fighting through brutal combat across Europe. Many had lost friends during the long advance from France into Germany. They had seen destroyed villages, shattered equipment, and the consequences of years of total war. Now a captured officer was asking them to show him respect because of the insignia on his shoulders. Some guards laughed it off. Others simply told him to return to the prisoner area and stop causing problems. But the officer refused to abandon the issue. Each time he spoke to a guard, he seemed determined to reinforce the same point. Rank still mattered. Officers still deserved proper treatment. Military traditions should still be observed, even in captivity. From his perspective, these demands were completely reasonable. In the German military culture he had grown up in, rank was never something that simply disappeared. Even prisoners of war were expected to maintain their status and dignity as officers. The idea that lower-ranking soldiers from an enemy army could simply ignore that structure was deeply offensive to him. Yet the situation inside the camp continued to remind everyone that the war had changed everything. American guards gave orders without hesitation. Prisoners followed instructions or faced punishment. The old hierarchy that once defined the German army no longer had any real power here. Still, the officer's determination did not fade. Several prisoners later recalled hearing him speak passionately about military honor and the responsibilities of officers even in defeat. He insisted that discipline must be maintained, that traditions should be respected, and surrender did not erase the structure of command. But as the days passed, his frustration grew. Every time he attempted to assert his authority or demand recognition of his rank, he was met with indifference or dismissal from the guards. Some simply walked away while he was still speaking. Others responded with blunt reminders that he was now a prisoner like everyone else. For a man who had spent his entire life commanding respect, the experience was humiliating. Yet, instead of backing down, the officer became even more determined to make his point. Then, one day, something unexpected happened. Word spread through the camp that a senior Allied commander was visiting the area. Officers and guards began preparing for the inspection, making sure that the camp was organized and that security procedures were in place. Visits from ranking commanders were not unusual during the final months of the war. Senior officers often toured newly captured territory, inspected prisoner facilities, and spoke with frontline units about ongoing operations. But this particular visitor was not just any commander. He was a man whose reputation had spread across both Allied and German armies during the war. A general known for his aggressive tactics, relentless offensives, and blunt, uncompromising personality. Many German troops had heard his name long before they ever saw him. George C. Patton. As commander of the United States Third Army, Patton had driven his forces across France with astonishing speed after the Allied breakout from Normandy. His tanks had smashed through German defenses again and again, capturing towns, surrounding enemy units, and pushing relentlessly towards the German border. To his own soldiers, Patton was a symbol of aggressive leadership and battlefield confidence. To German troops, he was often seen as one of the most dangerous Allied commanders they faced. Now that same general was arriving to inspect the camp. When the proud German officer heard the news, he immediately saw an opportunity. Finally, he believed, there was someone of equal rank who would understand the importance of military tradition. Someone who would recognize that an officer deserved to be treated with proper respect, even in captivity. As the inspection party approached the camp later that day, guards moved into position, and prisoners gathered quietly behind the barbed wire to watch. No one knew that within minutes, a brief confrontation would occur that perfectly captured the harsh reality of Germany's defeat in 1945. Because the German officer who had spent days demanding respect was about to present his argument directly to one of the most feared generals of the Allied armies. And the answer he received was something he never expected.
The news spread quickly through the prisoner camp that a senior Allied commander was arriving for an inspection. Guards began moving with a little more urgency than usual, checking positions and making sure the basic order of the camp was maintained. Small groups of American soldiers gathered along the perimeter, watching the road that led toward the entrance. Inside the barbed wire, thousands of German prisoners also noticed the sudden change in activity. Word passed quietly from one group to another. A general was coming. For men who had spent their entire lives inside a rigid military culture, the presence of a high-ranking officer always meant something important. Even in captivity, many German soldiers instinctively reacted to the idea of a senior commander nearby. Some stood a little straighter. Others tried to observe what was happening as closely as possible. Soon, a small convoy of military vehicles appeared on the road outside the camp. Several jeeps rolled to a stop near the entrance gate, followed by a few staff cars. American officers stepped out first, speaking briefly with the guards responsible for the camp's security. Then another figure emerged from one of the vehicles. Tall, rigid in posture, and immediately recognizable to many soldiers who had heard stories about him throughout the war. It was George S. Patton. Even among Allied commanders, Patton had a reputation that was impossible to ignore. He was known for his aggressive leadership, his relentless belief in offensive action, and his ability to drive his troops forward faster than many believed possible. During the campaign across France in 1944, his army had advanced hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks, overwhelming German defenses and capturing thousands of prisoners along the way. Patton also had a personality that matched his battlefield reputation. He spoke bluntly, expected discipline from everyone around him, and had little patience for excuses or hesitation. Many German soldiers knew his name well. Some had faced his forces directly during the long retreat across France and into Germany. Others had heard reports from officers who described his attacks as fast, aggressive, and difficult to stop. Now the same general was walking through the entrance of the camp, accompanied by several American officers and a few guards. Patton's inspection moved quickly. He spoke briefly with the camp commanders, asked several direct questions about the number of prisoners, food distribution, and security arrangements, and then began walking along the perimeter areas where prisoners were gathered. From behind the barbed wire, hundreds of German soldiers watched quietly. For them, the sight carried a strange mixture of emotions. Some felt curiosity,
Others felt resentment or bitterness. A few simply observed the man whose army had helped bring their country to the edge of total collapse. Among those watching closely was the German officer who had spent days insisting that his rank deserved recognition. As he saw Patton approaching with the inspection group, the officer became convinced that this was finally the moment he had been waiting for. Here was a man who understood military hierarchy. A general speaking to another officer, even an enemy officer, would surely respect the traditions that governed professional armies. In the officer's mind, this was the perfect opportunity to correct what he believed had been a serious breach of military protocol inside the camp. He stepped forward toward the edge of the prisoner area, waiting until Patton and the accompanying officers were close enough to hear him clearly. Nearby guards immediately noticed the movement. Most prisoners stayed back during inspections, but this officer was moving with a clear sense of purpose. His posture was rigid, his expression serious, and his uniform, though worn from the final weeks of the war, still carried the insignia of rank on the shoulders. As Patton approached the section of the camp where the officer stood, the German spoke up. His voice was firm and formal, carrying the tone of someone accustomed to giving orders rather than standing behind barbed wire. He addressed Patton directly, identifying himself by rank and explaining that he was a German officer. Then he raised the complaint he had repeated several times over the previous days. He stated that he had not been treated with the respect due to his position. According to the officer, the American guards had failed to acknowledge his rank properly. They had spoken to him like an ordinary prisoner, issued instructions without formal courtesy, and ignored the traditions that officers were expected to observe when dealing with one another. For a brief moment, the entire area seemed to fall quiet. Nearby prisoners leaned forward slightly, curious to hear what would happen next. American guards exchanged quick glances, unsure how the general would respond to such a direct complaint from a captured enemy officer. Patton stopped. He turned his attention fully toward the German officer standing behind the wire. Those who witnessed the moment later remembered the brief pause that followed. Patton looked at the man carefully, taking in the uniform, the insignia, and the confident way the officer carried himself, even as a prisoner. It was clear that the German expected a certain kind of response. Perhaps a formal acknowledgement, perhaps even a recognition of shared military tradition between officers who had fought on opposing sides of the war. But anyone who knew Patton understood that he was not a man who followed expectations when it came to defeated enemies. His entire career had been built on one simple principle: victory determined authority. And at that moment, in April 1945, there was no doubt about who had won the war in the West. Patton stepped closer to the wire, looking directly at the officer who had just demanded respect. What he said next was brief, but the words would instantly destroy the argument the German officer had spent days trying to make. And in doing so, Patton would deliver a blunt reminder of the one reality that no rank, no uniform, and no tradition could change anymore. Germany had lost the war. The German officer standing rigidly behind the barbed wire had spent the past days rehearsing his argument in his mind. In his world, honor and rank mattered above everything else. He had spent decades rising through the officer corps, learning the traditions of command, discipline, and obedience. Even in the chaos of defeat, he believed those rules still applied. He believed that a man of Patton's stature would recognize his authority, that the uniform on his back and the insignia on his shoulders still carried weight. Yet when Patton stopped before him, tall, imposing, and unmistakably confident, all of those assumptions began to crumble. Patton's eyes scanned the officer with a mixture of appraisal and impatience. There was no acknowledgement of rank, no attempt to flatter, and no hesitation. Patton had spent his entire career testing the limits of man under fire, shaping his army to advance relentlessly. To him, these defeated soldiers were no longer opponents in a battlefield of equals. They were prisoners, and their previous status no longer mattered. The officer attempted one last assertion. He spoke of military protocol, the proper treatment of officers even in captivity, and the customs that governed international conduct. His voice carried authority and pride, echoing the tone he had used for decades when giving orders. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine that Patton, a man who had studied and respected military tradition, might concede some recognition, even if begrudgingly. But Patton was not a man to indulge illusions. His response was brief but devastatingly effective. With a few cold, deliberate words, he stripped away the officer's pretense of authority. There was no negotiation, no debate about custom or honor. Victory, Patton reminded him, determined authority. The war was over, and the officer's power, his rank, and his prestige had all evaporated with Germany's defeat. The officer froze. For the first time, he understood that the hierarchy he had relied upon for his entire career had been rendered meaningless. No amount of formal greeting, no display of uniform or decoration could change the fact that the battlefield now belonged to Patton and the Allied forces. His pride, once a shield, now felt like an illusion. Around them, the scene was quiet but charged with tension. Guards who had been watching the officer all week leaned on their rifles with subtle curiosity, seeing the moment unfold firsthand. Other prisoners craned their necks to catch a glimpse, sensing that this encounter was different from the usual daily routines of the camp. It was not just an argument about respect. It was a stark lesson in the reality of war, power, and defeat. Patton's words had a ripple effect. Even among other officers who had clung stubbornly to the idea of rank, the lesson was unmistakable. The old structures of authority no longer applied. The conventions, the titles, the insignia, all of it was meaningless in the face of total defeat. The only thing that mattered now was who had the power to control events, to enforce order, and to decide outcomes. For the German officer, the lesson was personal and immediate. He had spent years studying strategy, commanding troops, and enforcing discipline, believing in a system that rewarded competence and honor. Yet here, in this muddy prisoner-of-war camp, all of that training and experience counted for nothing. He had been reduced to a man under someone else's command, forced to confront the total collapse of the world he had known. Observers later recalled the officer's reaction. There was no outburst, no challenge, and no visible display of anger. Instead, there was a moment of stunned realization. Pride and arrogance, which had sustained him through years of war, gave way to the bitter clarity of reality. He understood, as every German soldier in the West would soon understand, that the war was over, and there was no longer a place for illusions of honor or authority. The encounter also reflected a broader truth about the closing weeks of World War II in Europe. In camp after camp, in village after village, in shattered cities, countless officers and soldiers were learning the same lesson. The Allied advance had already demonstrated the futility of resistance. Entire armies had surrendered, supply lines were gone, cities lay in ruins. Any officer who still clung to the old hierarchy was fighting not against an enemy, but against reality itself. Yet there was something almost symbolic about this particular confrontation. It captured, in a single moment, the collision between pride, tradition, and the unyielding truth of defeat. Patton, the man who had carved his reputation through speed, aggression, and the refusal to tolerate hesitation, embodied the power now controlling the battlefield. The German officer, rigid in posture and clinging to old values, represented the world that had just ended. Patton did not linger. After delivering his words, he continued the inspection, moving methodically through the camp, checking security and asking questions of his staff. But the impact of that brief exchange endured. For the officer, it was a lifelong lesson in humility and in the harsh hierarchy of victory. For the guards and prisoners witnessing it, it was a demonstration of the reality of power, that authority comes not from uniform, rank, or tradition, but from the ability to control outcomes. In the days that followed, the officer, like so many others, began to adjust to this new reality. He learned that survival, cooperation, and adaptation had replaced honor, protocol, and pride as the rules of life in captivity. Across Europe, the same lesson played out repeatedly as Germany's defeat became undeniable. The story of that brief confrontation remains a powerful reminder of the end of World War II in Europe. It shows how pride can collide with reality, how leadership is defined by results rather than ceremony, and how a single encounter can encapsulate the collapse of an entire military system. For the German officer who demanded respect, the moment with Patton became an unforgettable lesson. In the end, victory decides everything, and the rest must accept it. Even now, decades later, historians and veterans alike recount the encounter not only as a dramatic human story, but as a symbol of the truth that dominated the final weeks of the war. The old order was gone, and the reality of defeat spared no illusions.